Hey, Krista Hoyt was responsible, punctual, and never missed a shift at the sheriff's office where she worked part-time. So when she didn't show up for work on the evening of August 25, 1990, her supervisor was immediately concerned. After repeated calls went unanswered, two deputies were sent to check on her. They arrived at her small duplex in Gainesville around 11 a.m. on Sunday the 26th, just hours before the bodies of Christine and Sonia were discovered across town. When the deputies got to Krista's apartment, there were no signs of forced entry. But when they peeked through the blinds of her sliding glass door, what they saw was so disturbing that one of them ran outside and vomited. Inside, they saw Krista's body, naked, decapitated, and staged in a horrific, theatrical position on a stool. Her head was sitting on a shelf facing the body, as if to taunt the authorities who would inevitably find her. She had been stabbed multiple times in the back, and her killer had again used tape and cleaning products, just like at the Powell Larson crime scene. Panic erupted in Gainesville. Three young women had now been brutally murdered in eerily similar ways: posed, sexually humiliated, stabbed with precision, and post-mortem cleaned. Police began working around the clock, certain a serial killer was on the loose. They advised female students not to walk alone. Many dropped out of school, parents pulled their kids out of class, and gun sales in the area skyrocketed. And then, just 2 days later, it happened again. On August 27th, the bodies of Tracy Poles and Manny Tabawada, both 23-year-old University of Florida students, were found in their off-campus apartment. Manny was a 6 feet 3 inches, 200-plus lb former football player, and yet he had been taken completely off guard and stabbed to death. Tracy, just like the other female victims, had been raped, killed, and positioned in a sexually degrading manner. Again, cleaning supplies were used. Again, the door showed signs of being pried open with a tool like a screwdriver. Now 5 people were dead in just 4 days. A curfew was imposed, and Gainesville felt like a city under siege. Students barricaded themselves in dorms, classes were nearly empty, and national media outlets began descending on the city. But then, the murders stopped. With no new killings and no clear suspect, detectives were left scrambling. Multiple leads came in, including reports of suspicious men seen in the area, but nothing concrete materialized, until a man named Danny Rolling was arrested several months later, in 1991, for an armed robbery in Ocala, just 40 miles away. Inside the campsite where he had been hiding out, police discovered tools that matched the marks found on the apartment doors in Gainesville, including a screwdriver and duct tape. Even more incriminating, they found audio tapes where Rolling confessed in detail to the murders of all 5 students. Danny Rolling had a dark and violent history. He had been abused as a child, drifted across the country committing various crimes, and had fantasized for years about becoming famous through murder. He admitted to committing the Gainesville killings alone, using burglary as a pretext to gain access to the homes. His motive? He said he wanted to become a superstar, a serial killer remembered forever. He was ultimately convicted of the 5 murders and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006, but his crimes, particularly the brutal and cinematic way he staged his victims, left a haunting legacy. And that legacy found its way into pop culture. In 1996, screenwriter Kevin Williamson, who had followed the Gainesville murders as a student, was inspired by the paranoia, the grotesque staging of the victims, and the terror that gripped the town, and wrote the script for a little film called Scream. The opening scene, where a masked killer stalks and murders a teenage girl in her home, echoes the fear that Gainesville residents lived through in real life. Got it? Here's the full story in smooth narrative form, no bullet points, no interruptions. In the summer of 1990, Gainesville, Florida was gearing up for the return of thousands of students for the new academic year at the University of Florida. It was a time of excitement, energy, and anticipation. But in just a matter of days, the city would descend into one of the darkest chapters in its history. On August 26th, Patricia and Frank Powell arrived at their daughter's new apartment. Their 17-year-old daughter, Christina Powell, was supposed to have started classes that Monday alongside her roommate, Sonia Larson. But Christina hadn't called home as promised. When the Powells reached her door, they found several handwritten notes taped to it, messages from friends who had stopped by and gotten no answer. Worried, They asked a maintenance worker to help them enter the apartment. He agreed, but only with police present. A single officer arrived, and with the manager and maintenance worker, entered the unit while Patricia and Frank waited outside. Moments later, the maintenance worker came sprinting out of the apartment and collapsed, sobbing and vomiting on the lawn. The Powells ran past him and forced their way into the apartment. Inside, they found their daughter Christina, nude, stabbed to death, and posed in a cruel, degrading position on the floor by the couch. Upstairs, the officer discovered Sonia, also nude, also stabbed, posed in a similar way on her bed. Police quickly realized this was not a random act of violence. There were signs the killer had entered with a screwdriver, cleaned parts of the scene, used duct tape to restrain the victims, and removed it later. All signs of control and intent. The scene was disturbing, cold, and methodical. What the public didn't know was that just 12 hours before those bodies were discovered, a young woman named Krista Hoyt had failed to show up for her shift at the sheriff's office. She was known to be incredibly reliable, so when she didn't answer her phone and never showed up, concern grew fast. Police went to her apartment and found her through the sliding glass door. She was nude, stabbed, and decapitated. Her head had been placed on a shelf next to her body in a way that made it appear to be looking down at itself. Her wrist showed residue from duct tape. She had also been sexually assaulted. With 3 gruesome, similar murders happening in less than 48 hours and within a few miles of each other, Gainesville was in a state of panic. Stores ran out of locks, weapons, mace. Students began traveling in groups, sleeping in shifts, staying with strangers just to feel safe. But the killer wasn't finished. 2 days later, on August 28th, 23-year-old Tracy Poles and her roommate, Manny Tabawada, were found dead in their apartment. Manny, a large former football player, had been stabbed multiple times in bed, likely never even having a chance to fight back. Tracy, like the other female victims, was nude, sexually assaulted, stabbed to death, and posed on her bed in a sexually explicit position. The back door had been pried open with a tool, and the same clues, duct tape residue, missing tape, and cleaning products, were found at the scene. By now, Gainesville was in a complete state of terror. Students fled the university. Families pulled their children out of classes. Police flooded the streets with patrols and roadblocks, but the damage had been done. 5 students were now dead, and whoever was doing this was still out there. Weeks passed, and the murders stopped. The trail went cold. That was until January 1991, when a man named Danny Rolling was arrested for robbing a grocery store. He'd been living in a wooded campsite just outside Gainesville. When police searched the site, they found tools matching those used in the break-ins, along with audio diaries in which he confessed to the murders in chilling detail. There were also drawings and songs referencing his crimes. Rolling had a long, violent history, a troubled past filled with abuse from his father, and a deep-seated hatred for society. They're reading about the grissom triple homicide in Shreveport, Louisiana, the clean crime scene, the lack of forced entry, the positioning of Julie's body, the vinegar used to clean her. They were stunned by the eerie parallels. It felt like déjà vu. It was almost as if the same person had committed both sets of murders. He later confessed not only to the 5 Gainesville murders, but also to a triple homicide in Shreveport, Louisiana, a family killed in their home a year earlier in a strikingly similar fashion. In 1994, Danny Rolling pleaded guilty to all 5 Gainesville murders. He was sentenced to death and executed in 2006. He never apologized. His final words were a song. Years later, screenwriter Kevin Williamson watched a documentary about the Gainesville Ripper while staying in a house alone. That night, he began writing what would become Scream, the iconic 1996 horror film about a masked killer who stalks and murders students in a quiet town, bringing chaos, fear, and media frenzy in his wake. Though Scream is fictional, the story that inspired it, the real terror that gripped Gainesville, was all too real. A string of brutal murders, a town living in fear, and a killer who wanted nothing more than to shock the world. And he did. Now suddenly, the Gainesville police had a potential new lead. Whoever had murdered the Grissoms in 1989 may have moved to Florida and struck again, this time 5 times over. But they still had no name. That would change thanks to a woman named Cindy Jurisic. Cindy had once lived in Shreveport. She had been watching the news about the Gainesville murders when she noticed how much the killings reminded her of what happened to her old friend Julie Grissom and her family. But what really grabbed her attention wasn't just the details of the crimes. It was someone she used to know, a man named Danny Rolling. She remembered Danny because, shortly after the Grissoms were murdered, he had suddenly left Shreveport with no explanation. Before leaving, he had made troubling comments to her husband about wanting to leave one day and become a superstar like Ted Bundy. He also had a history of violence, mental illness, and run-ins with the law. So Cindy called the Shreveport police and told them, "You need to look into Danny Rolling." Shreveport officers relayed this tip to the FBI and to the Gainesville Police Department. And that's when everything began to fall into place. Danny Rolling, it turned out, had recently been arrested in Ocala, Florida, not for murder, but for robbing a Winn-Dixie supermarket at gunpoint. He had been sitting in jail this entire time, completely under the radar. Investigators tracked down a campsite he had been living in, not from the Gainesville murder scenes, and what they found there sealed his fate. They recovered a bag filled with tools that matched marks left at the Gainesville crime scenes: a screwdriver, duct tape, gloves, and more. More chillingly, they discovered a small cassette recorder. On the tapes were audio diaries in which Rolling sang songs and gave cryptic confessions. He described murdering people, even vaguely mentioning the Gainesville crimes, almost as if he wanted to be caught. DNA tests soon confirmed it. The blood found at the Gainesville murder scenes belonged to Danny Rolling. His blood type matched the killer's. He had acted alone. And just like that, Ed Humphrey, who had been sitting in jail with a $1 million bail and publicly crucified as the suspected killer, was completely cleared. In 1994, Danny Rolling pleaded guilty to all 5 murders in Gainesville. During his confession, he admitted that he had stalked his victims before striking. He entered their homes through sliding glass doors or by prying them open, subdued his victims with duct tape, and then methodically murdered them. He claimed to be driven by an inner demon named Gemini, borrowing the name from The Exorcist III, a movie that had been playing around the time of the Gainesville murders. Rolling never showed remorse. In 2006, he was executed by lethal injection in Florida. His last words were not an apology, not a final confession, but a song. He sang a bizarre gospel tune as his victims' families watched from behind the glass. And while justice was served, the legacy of Danny Rolling's crimes lived on in pop culture. Screenwriter Kevin Williamson, after watching a documentary about the Gainesville Ripper, was inspired to write Scream, the now iconic horror film about a masked killer targeting college students. Williamson would later say it was the mix of true horror and media frenzy that compelled him to write it, and Danny Rolling's story was the gruesome seed at its core. But the reality behind Scream is far darker than fiction. 5 young people with promising futures, all senselessly taken. A town that will never forget the fear it lived through. And a killer who wanted to be remembered, and unfortunately, was. His hands. Danny rushed him and drove the knife into his back multiple times. Tom tried to fight back, but Danny overpowered and killed him. Then, Danny crept upstairs, where he found Julie Grissom in her bedroom. She was in the process of getting ready. There was makeup on her counter and a hairdryer still plugged in. Danny caught her completely off guard. He bound her with duct tape, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her to death. After she died, he used vinegar to clean her body, positioned her in a sexually humiliating pose, and then left her there. He wiped down surfaces and took the tape and any physical evidence with him before leaving the house the way he came in. 3 innocent people, a young woman, a grandfather, and an 8-year-old boy, were gone in one senseless spree. 6 months later, Danny shot his own father in the head and stomach after a brutal argument. His father survived, but Danny disappeared into the wind, fleeing Shreveport and driving south, with a mind filled with rage and a desire to become something more than just a criminal. He wanted to be infamous. He made his way to Gainesville, Florida, and over the course of just a few days in August of 1990, he brutally murdered 5 students: Sonia Larson, Christina Powell, Krista Hoyt, Manny Tabawada, and Tracy Poles, all while living in a tent in the woods near the University of Florida. He crept in through sliding glass doors, pried open with a screwdriver. He used duct tape to subdue his victims. He positioned their bodies in grotesque poses. He assaulted them. He cleaned the crime scenes. He left almost no evidence. And he got away with it, at least for a while. It wasn't until he robbed a local grocery store and left behind a bag with dye-stained money, a tape recorder, and that infamous screwdriver that the trail finally led to him. And even then, it took months and a crucial tip from a woman named Cindy in Shreveport to connect it all. In the end, Danny Rolling was convicted of the 5 student murders and sentenced to death. He later confessed to the Grissom murders as well. On October 25, 2006, Danny Rolling was executed by lethal injection. As the lethal drugs entered his veins, he sang a gospel hymn, a haunting and chilling finale for a man who had terrorized so many. But the legacy of his crimes lives on, not just in the memories of those he hurt, or in the trauma he left behind, but in the horror movie Scream, whose writer, Kevin Williamson, was inspired by the Gainesville Ripper when he penned the script. The true story behind Scream is not about a masked killer in a Halloween costume. It's about a deeply disturbed man who hunted real people and destroyed real lives, all for the sake of infamy. His hand still holding the stakes, Danny leapt out and stabbed him. And even though Tom put up a fight, he was very quickly subdued as well. After that, Danny made his way upstairs to where Julie, Sean's aunt, was getting ready for a wedding she planned to attend that night for one of her friends. She had just gotten out of the shower and was about to put on a red dress she had picked out. Danny walked into her room, and she most likely saw him. At that point, he would have told her what he had just done to her loved ones downstairs. He threatened her with a knife, saying that if she didn't listen to him, he would do the same to her. Terrified, she complied. Danny immobilized her, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her to death. Afterwards, he cut the tape off her wrists, pocketed it, and then carefully laid her on her back on the bed. He went downstairs, retrieved vinegar, and used it to try and clean her body, to destroy any evidence. Then, he posed her in a lewd, suggestive way, with her hands above her head and her legs spread, and he left. 6 months later, in August of 1990, after Danny shot his father and was on the run, he found himself in Gainesville, Florida. He set up a small camp in the thick woods just behind the University of Florida. On Friday, August 23rd, as he sat in his campsite, he felt a sudden urge to kill again. That night, he picked up his audio recorder and eerily recorded himself alluding to what he was about to do. "Well, I'm going to sign off for a little bit, but there's something I got to do." Armed with a pistol, a screwdriver, and his K-bar knife, Danny left his camp and walked about a mile through the forest. Eventually, he stood in the tree line, looking out at a 3-story white apartment building. Within the past day, he had seen 2 young women go in and out of that building. That was all he needed. He left the forest, entered the apartment complex through an access door, and climbed the stairs to the unit shared by Christine Powell and Sonia Larson. Using his screwdriver, he popped the door open, stepped inside, and found Christine asleep on the couch. He let her be, crept upstairs, and found Sonia asleep in bed. Standing over her, he decided she would be the one to kill first, and Christine would be the one he would assault. He calmly walked into Sonia's room, placed duct tape over her mouth to muffle her scream, and then stabbed her in the chest. She fought hard, but he overpowered and killed her. He then returned to the living room, where Christine still slept. He woke her up, held the knife to her, and told her he'd killed her roommate. If she didn't cooperate, she'd be next. Christine obeyed. He bound her wrists, removed her clothes, sexually assaulted her, and then stabbed her to death. After she was dead, he cleaned her body with soap and water, removed the duct tape, and arranged her in a degrading pose. Then, he went back upstairs, cut the clothes off Sonia, and positioned her body as well before leaving. Back at his camp, he was too charged up to rest. 8 hours later, in the early hours of August 24th, he left again, looking for another victim. He remembered seeing a woman a few days earlier inside an apartment and guessed that she lived alone. That woman was Krista Hoyt. Danny walked the half-mile to her apartment, broke in through her sliding glass door with his screwdriver, only to find no one home. So he hid in her bedroom closet. Hours later, around 11 a.m., Krista returned. Once he was sure she hadn't noticed him, he slipped out of the closet, grabbed her in a chokehold, and subdued her. When she agreed to do what he said, he bound her wrists, gagged her, brought her into the bedroom, removed her clothes, and sexually assaulted her before stabbing her to death. He removed the duct tape, posed her body, and left, but realized later he had left his wallet inside. Without hesitation, He returned, retrieved the wallet, and then made a horrific decision. He mutilated her body. He decapitated Krista, placed her head on a shelf next to the bed, twisted it so it looked down at her body, then left again. 48 hours later, on the night of August 27th, Danny felt the urge once more. He walked out of his camp with his tools and approached an apartment at random. Inside were Manny Tabawada, a large, strong former football player, and his roommate, Tracy Poles. Danny broke in, found Manny asleep, and attacked. Manny put up a tremendous fight, but was ultimately stabbed to death. Tracy, having just exited the shower, heard the struggle and saw Danny stabbing Manny. She screamed, ran to her room, slammed the door, and tried to keep it shut. But Danny broke through. When he entered, Tracy asked, "Are you the one?" He replied, "Yes, I am the one." He bound her, threatened her, removed her clothes, sexually assaulted her, and killed her. Then, as with the others, he cleaned her, posed her, and left. Later that same day, Danny robbed a Gainesville bank. He fled into the woods and abandoned a bag of dye-stained money, along with a gun, a screwdriver, and an audio recorder containing a chilling message. A month later, Danny Rawling was arrested for a failed armed robbery. While in jail, investigators linked him to the 5 Gainesville murders and, eventually, to the triple homicide in Shreveport. On October 25, 2006, Danny was executed by lethal injection. He offered no apology, said no final words, only sang a religious hymn to himself as the drugs took effect. And that was the end of the Gainesville Ripper.